everyone for joining us in our webinar, Making Change, Tell the Story, where we'll try to share with you the very potted version of what we know about measurement, evaluation and learning. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands I'm joining you from, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulkarni Nation, who've cared for this land for over 60,000 years. I pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and acknowledge that in Australia, sovereignty was never ceded, and we're living on what is and always will be Aboriginal land. I'm Anna Strempel, a principal consultant at Clear Horizon and a mentor with the Clear Horizon Academy. Clear Horizon's based in Australia, and we're all about using our measurement, evaluation and learning skills to support people creating positive impact in the world. Now, today's session is ambitious. We're going to try and walk you through what MEL is in under an hour and leave some time for questions at the end. This will be an introductory version of what we've learned as an organisation in over 20 years, and it's a very condensed overview of what we cover in our upcoming 15-week MEL course. So there'll be a lot to take in, but we're recording the session and you will receive a link to the video in a follow-up email, so you can come back to it later as much as you need. As we go through the session, if you'd like to ask a question, please just type your question into the Q&A box that you should see on your screen. And if someone's already asked a similar question, instead of adding a new one, please just upvote the one that's already there. And then when it's time to move to audience questions, the ones that have received the most upvotes will be answered first. We'll respond to questions at the end, but you can type them in and vote on them throughout the session. Okay, that's enough about us. Now for a little bit about you. We've designed this session for those who might be working in the social or environmental impact or services space, and perhaps your stakeholders are starting to ask you about outcomes. You might be new to measurement, evaluation and learning, or maybe you're looking for an introductory level refresh. Or perhaps you need to educate others about MEL. We've set up a quick poll. You should see it popping up on your screen. If you could please select the option that best describes where you're coming from. And I know we do have a lot of you joining us from Anzaia today, so kia ora to you. We can see your responses starting to come in there, and it looks like we have a lot of people working in the social impact or services space. That's currently about 40% of you. The numbers are going up and down a bit. And quite a lot of you also in government or legal services, and some people who are here just looking for a speedy refresher on MEL. Okay. Well, that's enough, I guess, on that one. We'll move on and have a look at some of the main reasons that people who are trying to make change get interested in MEL. One of the main reasons that people come to MEL is because they want to get clear and on the same page about what they're attempting to achieve, or because they want to work out what numbers and stories they need to collect in order to track their progress, and because they want to powerfully report out to their community and others about what they've learned and what difference they've made. The good news is we definitely will be sharing with you in this session what MEL is and how you can use it for clarity, accountability and greater efficiencies around reporting. And on that note, you should have the second poll popping up on your screen now. We'd love to hear what you're most keen to get out of today's session. Okay, and it looks like most people are here to learn about how to demonstrate impact and some tips for outcomes measurement. People are also interested in key terms and concepts for MEL. Okay. Well, as useful as all of those things are, they're not the main reason that we love MEL, and they're also not the reason why we think you should be excited about it. We're excited about the potential for MEL because when it's done well, it can help you create greater impact. And by greater impact, we don't just mean making more of it. It's also about making sure that your initiatives are truly reaching those who could most benefit, or that you're targeting the right issues, as well as giving you the chance to identify any unintended or negative impacts your programs might be having, and to do this early when you can still do something about it. MEL is all about the change you're creating. It's drawing your attention to the difference that your program or initiative is making in a structured and systematic way. MEL provides critical evidence and insights that can drive strategic decision-making and ongoing improvement. This means more outcomes and impact for your program. And the really good news is that when people can see how MEL is helping to improve programs, then people who might have previously seen MEL as a bit of a chore or maybe even a bore tend to get excited about it too. So let's have a look at the big top line reasons for doing MEL. The first key purpose, and arguably the most important, is so you can find out what's working, what isn't, and adapt and improve. The second key purpose of MEL is for accountability, so to prove that you're on track or prove where you got to at the end of a project. It's about giving accountability upwards to funders or leadership or ministers, as well as outwards to community and stakeholders. That's really showing what you've achieved. The third key purpose is to contribute to the broader knowledge base so others can benefit from it too. So that might include people beyond the stakeholders of your program who might be focused on developing or improving future programs or projects, or perhaps reforming policy. So now we've covered the why of MEL, let's jump into the what. And we'll start off with some principles for doing good MEL. We've developed these principles with our partners over 20 years of practice. The first one is that MEL should be learning oriented. Learning and adaptation, as opposed to accountability, should be the main driver of MEL. The second principle is that MEL should be impact driven. So its ultimate purpose is to create more and better impact, as opposed to just reporting it. The third, it needs to be outcomes focused. So MEL needs to measure more than just activities and outputs, so we can understand what difference we're making rather than just reporting on what we've done. The fourth principle is that it should be collaborative. MEL's best done in a participatory way rather than by just a single expert or a team of MEL people. Principle 5, it should be ethical and inclusive. MEL systems should be designed and implemented to the highest ethical standards, and they should foster self-determination. Principle 6, they should be customised for each context. So good MEL is not a cookie cutter process. It's something that's customised to context and need. Principle 7 is stories and numbers. So using both quantitative data, which is numbers, and qualitative data, which is stories, enables richer descriptions that will help your key audiences to understand and learn from your impact. The final principle is that MEL should set and answer the big questions. So it goes beyond measurement. It's really asking groups to step back, to set and address a small number of big questions about the overall value of a program. So now we've covered the principles for good MEL, let's have a look at how we define M, E, and L. At Clear Horizon, we define the term measurement as the ongoing and continual act of measuring routine data and drawing out insights. So some people use the term monitoring to describe this. When we think about measurement, we often think about numbers, but good measurement includes both qualitative data and quantitative data, so stories and numbers. It can be very high-level population data, so ABS statistics, for example, or it can be program activity-based, so how many people turned up to your community events and what did they think of them. We can think of measurement as being like a snake. A snake typically travels on the ground, it leaves a continuous trail, and you can see a trend. And sometimes those trend lines might be quite wiggly. The snake is always in contact with the ground, just like your measurement activities are always in contact with your program. Evaluation tends to be more analytical than measurement, and involves making judgments about how good an intervention has been in terms of specific criteria or values. So it generally draws on the measurement data you've been collecting throughout, and it can involve additional data collection to give you a fuller picture. The key thing to note is that it's all about judgments. So it can be conducting an evaluation study. These are often conducted externally, and they're done at periodic points in the program cycle. So often midway through and then again at the end of a program or initiative. Evaluation studies usually result in a report, and they may include some recommendations. This is what most people think about when we mention evaluation. But evaluation can also be the act of making an evaluative judgment. So for example, when you look at your measurement data and decide things aren't working, you're doing an act of evaluation. And this doesn't necessarily involve writing a report. Both of these ways of applying evaluation involve making an evidence-based judgment about the value or quality of something. If measurement is like a snake, we can think of evaluation as a kangaroo. A kangaroo hops in and out, and it's not as continuous as measurement. It can also leap high to take a higher level perspective and be more analytical. The L is where it all comes together. We say strategic learning happens when groups and organisations use data and insights from the measurement and evaluation they do and translate this into actionable learnings. They adapt their strategy in response to what they've learned through all that measurement and evaluation work. In other words, responding to what the data is telling them. This might take the form of a set of recommendations at the end of an evaluation report, which are then implemented, or it might be when a program team decides to change their activities or even completely redesign their theory of change based on what they've learned from measurement and evaluation. It's about doing something with what you've learned. We can think of learning as being like an owl. The owl is wise, it has a depth of knowledge, and it learns from all its mistakes. It makes considered decisions, but it's also humble and knows it must never stop learning. A nice simple way to bring that all together is to think about MEL in terms of these three questions. Measurement asks what happened, evaluation asks so what, and learning asks what now. And we'll return to these three questions as we move through the webinar. Okay, at this point, I wanted to touch on the difference between outputs and outcomes. It's something that often comes up and it can be a little confusing. It's important to note that our field is diverse and growing, and there's not always 100% agreement on the terms that we use. But our definition, and one that's pretty commonly understood, is that outputs tell us what's been done, so usually activities or things we've produced. Outcomes tell us what's been achieved or what's changed. These can be short, medium, or long-term changes. In the cartoon, you can see the output is the number of times the learner ghosts said boo. Those are the outputs. The outcome they're seeking is to strike fear in the hearts of the living. A more relatable example might be, we delivered some community workshops. Those are the outputs. The outcome is that people learnt a new way of doing things and ultimately changed their practices. We can also think of outputs as the work, whereas outcomes are what has changed because of that work. This is important because we often see impact reports which focus on what's been done. So how many wells have been built, for example. But too often we don't see the actual change being reported on. So do people now have access to clean water who didn't previously? How has this affected their health and well-being? These are the sorts of changes that we're usually seeking to influence. So now we've touched on why you might be here, why we think MEL is one of the most important tools in the Changemakers kit, and touched on what it is. Let's have a look at the how of MEL, and we'll start with the M. It's difficult to measure progress if you haven't described what success would look like. So before we jump straight into measuring things, we need to get clear about exactly what our project, program or initiative is trying to achieve and how we expect that change to happen. We do this using a theory of change. They're often also called program logic. A theory of change maps out the cause and effect relationship between the things you do and the changes you expect to see because of it. They're the foundation of good MEL, and they're also excellent for helping you to design really strategic and targeted programs. If you and your stakeholders aren't on the same page when it comes to the outcomes you're looking for, or if you've made some big assumptions that might turn out not to be true, well, it's better to find that out early before you start trying to measure and evaluate your work. And a theory of change can really help with that. A theory of change often starts as a sort of messy diagram, which will ultimately be refined into something you can use to communicate about your program. It should help you to clarify the outcomes you hope to achieve by the end of the program, how you think these outcomes will be brought about, and what the interim results might be. They should also help you to identify the key assumptions you're making. So let's look at an example. A theory of change can be a powerful tool for use in really complex contexts. It can be highly sophisticated and incorporate a lot of nuance. But for now, I'd like to show you through a really quite simple example. This one is a real case study from a program we worked with in Vanuatu. The problem was that not enough children were completing school, and our client wanted to change that. So the big high-level goal they set was that more children would complete school in Vanuatu. Now that's a very broad goal, and a lot of things would have to change for that to happen. A lot of those would be outside of our client's scope. So they had to decide what their unique contribution would be. They decided to focus on getting more children to attend early years education in primary school and staying there. They set the following end of program outcomes. I'll just give you a moment to have a look at those. The outcomes they were looking for were that all girls and boys are able to access early years schooling, that more children enrol at primary school, and that children stay at primary school for longer without repeating. End of program outcomes are the longer term changes you hope to bring about through your work. They should be ambitious but achievable, and they should result reasonably directly from your work. They are your ultimate contribution to that big broad goal. So now that they'd set their end of program outcomes, they then had to look at what was preventing those things from happening and what would need to change if those outcomes were going to be achieved. So that's where the intermediate outcomes come in. These are usually changes at the stakeholder level, so changes in knowledge, beliefs, skills, changes in practices, policies, resources, and so on. Intermediate outcomes are outside of your immediate control, but you're aiming to influence them. In this case, the team understood that if girls and boys were to access early years schooling, enrol in primary school and stay there, then communities would need to value education if they're going to send their kids in the first place. Children with disability would need to be able to access and engage in education. And then on the more structural side, the cost of schooling needed to be affordable. School facilities and equipment needed to be adequate, and they needed to be safe enough that parents would send their children along. There also needed to be enough schools and classrooms and in the right places. So those were the intermediate outcomes that they were hoping to influence. They then decided what their program would do to try to bring about those changes. And you can see that they've got several activities. These are groupings of activities down the bottom. These are essentially their strategies for influencing those changes. They're going to do some engagement with the community. They're going to offer some fee subsidies, and they're going to focus on locally relevant and efficient delivery of facilities and equipment. So you can see, if you look from the bottom to the top, you can see the cause and effect pathways through which they were expecting to influence change. And there are just a few key things to note here. Firstly, the activities are in the program's direct control, but everything after that is the change they hope to influence. And second, that big broader goal up at the top is a high-level vision that this program alone would never achieve by itself. The outcomes are its contribution towards that goal. And throughout the theory of change, you'll notice that the statements are worded in simple present tense. Developing a theory of change is also a great way to get clear about any important assumptions we're making about things that are outside of our control and influence, but which will affect our program success. So in this case, we've noted two key assumptions. They are that school is of sufficient quality to be valued, and that there are local providers who can help deliver and build facilities and equipment. And you can see that if we get those things wrong, they're not in our control, but our program is going to really struggle to achieve what we've set out to. So that's a simple theory of change in a nutshell. Okay, and what we've got here are some tips on what makes a good theory of change. We won't cover them now, but you can read them when we send the slides through to you later. And if you're interested in theory of change, we do have a new advanced theory of change course launching in October. So now I'll hand over to Niketa to talk us through the next steps of measurement.
Thank you, Hannah. So again, my name is Niketa Kulkarni. I am a principal consultant within the international team at Clear Horizon. And I'll be talking you through the measurement framework. So once we have a clear theory of change, and we know the changes that we're looking for, we can work on developing a measurement framework to help track whether these changes are happening and identify and address challenges or problems before progressing too far in the program cycle. In a nutshell, a measurement framework is a list of things that we want to measure to see if changes are happening or if they're not. The focus is on measuring whether changes are happening at the stages of the program anticipated in the theory of change to confirm whether the program is on track. We recommend collecting a mix of quantitative data or numbers and qualitative data such as stories to better understand breadth and depth. Measurement can occur at different levels. It can involve high-level population information such as census or national employment data, which are often used to see if changes are happening at the top levels of your theory of change, where the impacts are expected to be longer term and perhaps at scale. Measurement can also leverage more local level information, such as attitudes towards diversity in the community, or specific measures of the program's activities, like how many people are attending your events. These are usually, but not always, conducted by the people doing the change-making work. It's important that you don't measure too much or too little. Too much, and it becomes too burdensome. Also, too much data can be overwhelming and difficult to make sense of. On the other hand, if you have too little, you may not have enough to notice the changes being made. Consider asking yourself, what data do I absolutely need to understand change? Is it feasible within my resources? And if not, are there other options? Being pragmatic can oftentimes be more important than precision in deciding how much to measure. We'll talk about this in more detail in a bit. So what are measures? Measures are data that help us see if something is changing or not, and in what kinds of patterns. In our personal lives, we measure things all the time, like our weight, our bank balance, and maybe, if you regularly practice mindfulness, how you are feeling in the moment. In MEL, we are mostly interested in ongoing measurements of things that might change because of our interventions or because of what we do. People often associate measures with numbers, such as simple counts or proportions. But measures can also include stories and narratives which can provide more depth to our understanding. Such measures might include narratives about achieving milestones or stories of significant change. Remember good MEL principle number 7. Using both qualitative data or stories and quantitative data, or numbers, enables richer descriptions that will help your key audiences understand and learn from your impact. In the next slide, we'll look at an example of a measurement framework. So there are many ways to display a measurement framework, but here we use a simple table format. As I said before, a measurement framework specifies what changes you want to see and the measures that help you see those changes. When making a measurement framework, it is important to recognize that it's impossible to measure everything. So you must prioritize which changes you want to measure. I'm happy to talk about this balance more in detail later if anybody's interested. But in this example, we've aligned our measurement framework directly to our Vanuatu education theory of change. We've selected an output and a couple of outcomes at different stages of the program for illustration purposes. There are many ways to measure change, and these are just a few examples. So let's start with the bottom row of the table, level 3. These are things like reach and activity measures or outputs that you have direct control over. These are oftentimes the easiest to measure, and they mostly show you whether you are doing what you've set out to do. So in this example, we may want to track the total number of parent information nights that the program is running to raise awareness. We also want to make sure that these are being well attended, since just hosting information nights won't necessarily trigger the desired impacts unless people actually attend. So we may track the number of parents attending those information sessions, including basic demographics, to ensure that the program is appropriately inclusive. We may also measure their experience of attending the sessions to ensure that it remains positive. Moving up to level 2, we include an example about a community level outcome that is expected to result from the program's community engagement. To understand whether the community values and demands quality education, we may collect data to calculate the average number of community members on school committees. This measure, of course, assumes that those who join a school committee do so because they value and demand quality education. It's not a direct measure, but what we consider to be a proxy based on assumptions. If resources allow, we may further substantiate this measure with qualitative measures of committee members' attitudes through interviews. But our general, hopefully evidence-based understanding about the process of becoming committee members may be sufficient to use this measure as a proxy. Again, consider practicality over perfection. We may want to also include measures around instances and stories of parents going to the local school to make suggestions for improvements as another way to understand how much the community values and demands quality education. On the top is the highest level outcome that we want to measure, achieving an increase in the number of children enrolled in primary school. For this measure, we may use population level data that is already being collected by the government. To make sure that the program benefits are being widely distributed, we should probably disaggregate the population data by such factors as gender, disability status, Indigenous, First Nations, other community, or other relevant demographic markers. You can probably measure these level 1 outcomes less frequently, such as yearly or even every few years, especially at the beginning, since you would expect big picture changes to take a while to happen. However, for levels 2 and 3, it's important that you regularly keep track of this data so that you can keep tweaking and refining your activities. For example, having data about what kinds of parents you are attracting, and more importantly, not attracting to your informational sessions, can enable you to have data-informed discussions and decision-making. rather than relying on general impressions and assumptions. You can also share data with the community or stakeholders in quick and regular updates through things like dashboards or newsletters, rather than waiting for an evaluation report. My colleague Nikki will talk more about this learning aspect of measurement later. For now, I leave you with a reminder about good MEL principle number 2, that the ultimate purpose of MEL is to create more and better impact, as opposed to just reporting it. And principle number 3, that MEL needs to measure more than just activities and outputs, so that we can understand what difference we are making, not just on what we've done.
Thanks, Niketa. Just before we move into the E, evaluation, I just wanted to note that there is a Q&A option. So down the bottom of your Zoom window where you can see the chat function. If you've got questions as we go, please do add them to the Q&A rather than the chat, and that way we'll pick them up at the end when it's time to respond. If you see another question that asks what you were going to ask, just click on that and vote on it instead of adding it again. Okay, so if we move on to have a look at the E in MEL, evaluation. Where does the E fit in? Well, through your ongoing measurement, you've collected information about what's been happening. Evaluation then looks at that data and says, so what? Does that mean we've achieved the outcomes we set, or are we on track to do that? Why or why not? What's working well and what's not? So it's about making evaluative judgments. The data you've collected through your ongoing measurement will help to answer these questions, but an evaluation will most likely need to collect some additional information too. This might involve surveys or interviews with your stakeholders and beneficiaries, for example, and you might bring in someone external to do it for you, especially if you don't have evaluation people in-house. There are 3 main types of evaluation that we work with. Design evaluation, which asks whether the program was a good choice for the context. Process evaluation, which asks how well the program's been implemented. And results evaluation, which can also be called outcomes evaluation or impact evaluation. We're asking there whether the program achieved what it set out to do. So this can include looking at what has changed and whether that change was a result of our program. The type or types of evaluation you do can depend on where the program's up to in its life cycle, what's been done previously, and what the purpose of the evaluation is. Generally speaking, a midterm evaluation is typically very interested in process, whereas an evaluation at the end of a program will usually focus heavily on outcomes and results. However, we do often include all 3 types within one evaluation or in a sequence, and this can help us to tell a full story. So at the end of a program, we want to know whether the program worked. Did we achieve the desired change? And that's what the results or outcomes evaluation will tell us. But to understand why it did or didn't work, we'll probably need to explore process. So did we do things the right way? And design. Did we do the right things? And together that provides a fuller picture. Nikki will share an example shortly to illustrate the different types of evaluation and how they interact. But first, let's take a look at how we plan for evaluation. So to help prepare for evaluations, we typically create an evaluation plan or framework. This requires us to think through a set of questions, including all of those ones you can see on your screen. And it's probably useful for me to note again at this point that we will be sending the slides out to you, so you'll have this to return to. I won't read through them all right now, but I'll pick out a couple. One of the really important things we want to do after we've decided why we're doing the evaluation, who the audience will be, when we'll do it, we then need to get really clear on what our big questions are to know whether we've achieved the outcomes we wanted. These are called our key evaluation questions, and we're going to talk more about them in a moment. We then want to find out what data we need, what data we've already got, where the gaps are, and make some decisions about how we're going to analyse our data. We also need to decide who's going to do the evaluation. Okay, so let's jump through to the next slide. In the previous slide, we mentioned the big questions we want to answer. In MEL, we call these key evaluation questions, or KEQs. They're not the detailed questions that you'd ask in a measurement survey, for example. They're the overarching questions you want your whole evaluation to answer. So the work that you did to clarify the purpose of your evaluation and identify your key audiences and what they want to know will help to shape these questions. Ultimately, the KEQs will guide your evaluation and help you make value judgments to determine whether your program or initiative was successful. Nikki will now share an example of an evaluation that included all three types of evaluation and tell you a little bit about the KEQs that they used.
Brilliant. Thank you, Anna. So I'm Nikki Sloan. I'm the digital engagement lead, and I've worked with Anna in our Sustainable Futures team. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit now about the New South Wales koala strategy, which we were involved in the evaluation of, as well as the designing of the framework at the start. So in the New South Wales koala strategy, there were 4 different pillars that was trying to do a lot of stuff in about 3 years and focusing on different areas and trying to find out ways that they could stabilize the populations and ideally to halt the decline. So in this strategy, we saw questions addressing all 3 types of evaluation over the course of a midterm and final evaluation. So when we created the MEL framework at the start, we included a list of all of the KEQs that we would need to have answered by the end of the strategy. We also knew that we couldn't and shouldn't try and ask them all at once. We handled this by adding different emphasis at different points of evaluation. As you can see here, it would have made no sense to ask the outcomes related questions, to what extent has the koala strategy contributed to stabilizing the New South Wales koala population at the midterm in terms of trying to expect that. Because we wouldn't have had the data, we couldn't answer that straight away. We could talk about how likely or how on track we were to achieving those outcomes, but it was more of an indication of where it was going. However, the design question made total sense to ask at the start. So we've got here, to what extent does the design of the koala strategy address the drivers of population decline? So, apologies, I've just lost my train of thought. We've got an example question here, but we could also include questions around the strategy and the process about, to what extent has the strategy been delivered effectively? We could also ask questions there about to what extent have the right people and the right stakeholders been engaged at various points and in the most appropriate way for themselves. Thanks, Anna. I'll pass back over to you.
Thanks, Nikki. So hopefully that example has helped to pull together those different types of evaluation and the way that we use KEQs to frame evaluations. I'm actually going to now hand straight back to Nikki to take us through the often overlooked but really critical aspect of MEL, which is learning.
Brilliant. Thank you, Anna. I probably didn't need to hand it back to you, but I was enjoying our repartee. So finally, we get to talk about the L. This is personally my favourite part. It's really where we look at where the rubber meets the road. So what we want you to do here is developing our strategic learning and reporting strategy. This is very important because it's the main purpose of doing MEL. Without learning, we're just collecting data for the sake of it. And it's really important to take that next step and to think about how it applies and how we can use it. Strategic learning is all about using data and insights from multiple sources to refine and adapt your strategy. Strategic learning occurs when organizations or groups integrate data and evaluative thinking into their work and then adapt their strategies into response to what they learn. Ideally, this is also done in real time. So we talked about the evaluation studies being a point in time. Ideally, we want learning to be feeding in and operating continuously. So here, what we're thinking about when you're thinking about designing your learning strategy, what are the engagement points for learning? Who needs to be involved and when do they need to be involved? And also as part of that, you need to think about what are the best ways for people to be involved. So for instance, we'll talk about it a little bit more in a moment about identifying audiences and thinking about what is going to speak best to them. And then finally, we want to think about what reporting we need and how it links in. And also just coming back to it, who needs to be involved and when? Do we want to involve those people and those audiences before they get the final product to make sure that it's working? Some things like that. Okay, so we're now going to talk a little bit about applying your learnings. So applying your learnings can happen in both short cycles as you're doing the work and tweaking as required. So what we're just talking about in terms of that real-time learning, and in longer cycles where you might wait until you've collected enough evidence to make serious judgments and changes to your program. So in short cycles, we might be able to make regular use of the data you're gathering from your measurement activities and having evidence-informed discussions to update your activities. For example, in our Vanuatu schools case study, perhaps we note that the parent attendance is always lower on a particular night, say Friday. As a result, we tweak our activities to ensure we only run the parent sessions on Tuesdays and Thursdays when we have a higher attendance. For the longer cycle, so we can see up here, this might look as simple as a reflection workshop every 6 months so that you're being deliberate about drawing insights and patterns out. Or it might be that you're having an annual review where you can come together and check that you're still happy with your theory of change and the flow of expected change based on the evidence you've now collected. Learning doesn't have to be onerous or complicated. A great example I've seen of this is the Australian Institute for Disaster Resilience. They've made it really simple by running short cycle learning sessions each quarter, where they get together, they're each responsible for collecting particular data and collating it. They get together, look at that and ask themselves 3 questions. So what did we do well? What didn't work well? And what can we change to make things better? I'm going to pass over to Niketa now, who has a great example that she'd like to share.
Thanks, Nikki. So I'm currently providing MEL support to an 8-year, $300 million program in Papua New Guinea, funded by the Australian government. It focuses on building inclusive, sustainable, and locally led infrastructure throughout the country. And as you can imagine, there's just a lot going on within that program. To help make learning more manageable, we have developed short-term output indicators, which we review with the program teams on a monthly basis. We use those meetings to discuss progress and any necessary tweaks. This time also provides useful space to ensure that our do no harm protocols are being strictly adhered to. We also engage in 6 monthly reflection workshops where we look at intermediate outcome level data and again discuss progress and identify necessary tweaks to the program's activities and outputs to ensure that those intermediate outcomes are in fact on track. And then we have yearly reflection workshops, during which time we look at higher level data and reflect on the continued relevance of the theory of change in light of any new information that we've gathered throughout the year. And this goes on year after year and month after month to ensure that we're continuously learning and continuously building in short and long-term learning cycles into the programs, into the program to ensure continued impact and improvement.
Brilliant. Thank you for sharing that example, Niketa. So now we're going to move on to something I know, based on that earlier poll, that you are all really, or majority of people are very, very interested in, around communicating your impact. So this is really an exciting part, right? You've done the work, you've reflected, and now you actually get to report it and share it out with the world. So finding a good reporting product is fit for purpose and meets the audience's needs. So it's really important to think about who your audience is. So a couple of notes. Audiences are not homogenous, and you need to find out what your specific audience wants and deliver on that. Secondly, each audience might have different objectives with your insights. For example, an internal team will need the insights to adjust the program if needed, while the public might want to understand what the impact the organization is having. These 2 audiences will use different language, will need different levels of explanation and different levels of granularity, which also leads us to our 3rd point. How to best engage your audiences. That includes what channels do they use? How interactive should your report be? And how often should it be updated? Essentially, you want to look at each of your audience members or audience types individually and think about what they need to know and what format will best allow them to engage with that information. Don't make the mistake of trying to create one product that's going to meet everyone's needs, who are very different. Actually, I wanted to say Samantha Abbott from Visual Insights people does a really great job talking about this further in her workshop series, Making It Stick, an evaluation. Obviously, also our own course dives into this a lot more. And one thing I want to talk about a lot more is the digital dashboards. This is an area of expertise within Clear Horizon. It's also a bit of a passion of mine. So digital dashboards are increasingly used to support real-time learning because they, A, can help you efficiently consolidate multiple sources of data into one accessible tool. 2, can structure your analysis into metrics and indicators that matter to your organization. 3, help surface insights and make them accessible and easy to understand. And finally, empower users to explore the insights themselves. So it's really interesting looking at all of these different ways. So what we're going to do now is have a little look at a live example. So this dashboard is one that we use in our Power BI course to help learners to play with and understand how a dashboard can be structured. So it's just using dummy data, which is why we're able to share it publicly. The purpose of this dashboard is to show the spatial and demographic breakdown of participants in this particular program. For instance, if we look at the high level view of this, we can see the gender breakdown shows the majority of the participants were men at 60% and people who identified as white. However, if we filter on Brisbane, here represented by the koala, we can see that the gender balance shifts to majority women with 53% from cold communities. Compare this, if we then, so I'll just give you a moment to have a look at that and appreciate those. If we then have a click on Melbourne, which is represented here by the wombat, we can see a massive shift. We'll just wait for that to come up, brilliant. So we can see it's predominantly male, over 80%, and almost all half identifying or self-identifying as white. Now, there are a few uses for this information. To assist, one is to assist the project team members understanding who and where they are seeing the engagement and to identify if there are any key groups being over or underrepresented. This context is important for course correction and to give guidance on where to dig deeper to understand, the context, so we can dig in to understand, okay, why are we seeing more, for instance, potentially white men engaging in Melbourne and in Brisbane seeing more women from cold backgrounds. This provides an opportunity for alignment between regional teams and to learn from one another. For instance, both Brisbane and Melbourne have similar sex ratios of size men to size women, with both having a larger female population. So why is Brisbane seeing a higher participation of size women than in the Melbourne program? The same also goes for those cold communities. Ultimately, this assists in adjusting the program to ensure that engagement is maintained and also ensuring some of that equality and equity to the program. So what I'm going to do now is just have a quick reference to one other case study. So unfortunately, we don't have the time to go into this one in depth, but I wanted to highlight this as a great example from the Great Barrier Reef Foundation. This is one which focuses more on public-facing reporting and accountability to allow for not only Australian government, but also community members to come in and have a look at the different things that are being looked at. You can see this on their website, so I'd highly recommend going and having a look at it. Excellent, and I'll hand back over to you, Anna.
Great, thanks, Nikki. So all of these components that we've talked about today will generally come together in a MEL plan or framework. We walk you through how to create a MEL plan or framework step by step in our longer courses. If you want to know more, we would certainly need much longer than an hour to go through that. Both our complete guide to MEL and introduction to MEL course start at the end of July. So if you're interested, you can claim a 15% discount by using the code webinar15 when you purchase online. We'll also send you details of this along with the slide deck in the next few days. So no need to remember that one. In the meantime, this was our second ever mini MEL webinar. So we'd love to know how we did. We've got another poll popping up in your screen. You should be seeing that very shortly. And we'd love it if you could just give us a very quick bit of feedback before we move into responding to some of your questions. Okay, so I can see that people have been putting questions in the Q&A section throughout. Thank you for doing that. We'll pick up some of those questions now. Some of them might be a level of detail that we can't get into satisfactorily in the next 10 minutes. And so if so, we'll need to sort of, I guess, refer you outwards. But we will do our best to have a go at particularly the ones that have got the most votes on them. So our question with the most votes at the top, the person has asked, I'm interested to know where you go for reliable indicators of outcomes. And what does Clear Horizon do when a client's intended outcomes have few or less reliable associated indicators within the broader evidence base? Now, I'll quickly just have a look at Nikki and Niketa and see if either are nodding to respond. Okay, so this I would say is a fairly, a very common challenge. We're often working with imperfect data, and certainly when we're trying to measure longer term impact or impact that isn't easily sort of reduced down to a few questions in a survey. It's one of the really common challenges that we work with as evaluators. In some cases, in some sectors, there has been work done to develop consistent indicators that sit across a sector. So an example that I can think of is within the legal sector. The community legal centres got together a few years ago to develop a whole set of indicators that could be used by legal centres across the sector, and which fed back into a quite generic but very, very detailed framework. So different legal centres could just pick that up, apply the indicators that were relevant to them, use the tools that were relevant to them, and go with it. That is definitely the exception rather than the norm. We're not usually working with that. We do a lot of work on trying to come up with measures that make sense in the context. And I guess one of the key points that I would make here is, if you're thinking back to that theory of change, when we're coming up with indicators, we are really trying to make sure that they tie very strongly back to our theory of change. And certainly within the intermediate outcomes section of our theory of change is often where we'll be doing the most measurement, trying to understand whether those intermediate outcomes are or aren't happening. When your challenge is, how do I get reliable enough information? As a general rule of thumb, Clear Horizon sort of takes the view that it's better to measure the right things roughly than to measure the wrong things really accurately. So I certainly can't give you the sort of one answer to this question, but my advice and encouragement would be to spend most of your time understanding exactly what it is you need to know, and then you can do the work of figuring out, well, how on earth do we measure this? And from then on, it's iterative, because we're building this into a learning cycle over time. Our measures and our indicators can get better and can evolve, but it's really important just to get started and to do that with the right measures or outcomes. And certainly refer you to the full course for more detail. We spend a lot of time on that question in the full course. Okay. All right, if we move on to the question with the second most votes, the question is, if activities are inside our control, but intermediate outcomes are outside our control, how do we know that our activities have been the reason for the intermediate outcomes? Excellent question. We know this as the contribution attribution challenge, but I think I'll hand to Niketa to respond to this one.
Sure, thanks, Anna. And that is a fantastic question, and forms and is the center of many of the discussions that we have internally as well as with clients. So yes, activities are those that we consider within our control, and intermediate outcomes especially are those that we consider within our sphere of influence. And so there's a few different ways to know whether the activities are in fact contributing to changes seen at the intermediate outcome level. First, I think it's really important to ensure that your theory of change is backed by evidence. The theory of change serves as a hypothetical pathway between the between the outputs and those especially those higher level outcomes, and the intermediate outcomes are those stepping stones in between. it's important to go into those theory of change discussions with sufficient evidence to know with a certain degree of reliability that it's very likely that if those outputs are in fact completed to a certain degree of quality and standards, that those outcomes could be expected to follow. And that doesn't necessarily mean that you have 100% contributed to those outcomes if they do occur, but there's sufficient rationale to know that you're likely to have you don't have full attribution over those outcomes, but there's sufficient rationale to know that you've at least contributed to any outcomes that you see. The second, if there are resources to do so, you can consider developing a control group to test whether outcomes do result if across communities that where your interventions are not taking place. But perhaps rather than investing in a rigorous control or RCT, what we may want to do is actually engage in some qualitative work, where we develop stories of significant change, and we delve into stories to try and piece together how change manifested. So we might ask individuals to talk about the importance of those interventions. We may ask communities to talk about what the interventions meant to them and what changes they felt they could attribute to the interventions. Through the qualitative lens, we really get a firsthand perspective on how change occurs and what level of attribution or what level of contribution we may be able to assign to our work.
That's great. Thanks, Niketa. Now, I can see we're 2 minutes away from the close of the session, so we'll try and whip through a couple of quick answers. I can see a few questions here we can answer quickly. Firstly, the question, if your assumptions prove incorrect, do you need to change your whole theory of change? The answer would be sometimes. There are some types of assumptions where you can address them with where you can actually bring them into the scope of your theory of change, make some tweaks. There are other types of assumptions where you just want to keep record of them so that you can monitor and track them as you go and see whether you need to step in and start managing those risks more actively. There are other types of assumptions which we call killer assumptions, which are the ones where if you get those wrong, the whole program will not succeed. And if you've identified some big killer assumptions and you're not really confident that you've got them right, then we would certainly be in the territory of either being able to test those assumptions first or rethinking our theory of change if we're really not confident that we've got those ones right. So it depends on the assumption. And one final question that I think we can answer quickly. There are still many program designs that don't have theory of change. At what stage do you recommend including a theory of change for those programs? We are very often retrospectively fitting theory of change onto an existing program. The absolute ideal time to do theory of change is as early as you possibly can, because if you do it early enough, it can be a design tool that helps you to think through and test your ideas about how this program will work at a point where you can still change it. But certainly, even if the program already exists, we often end up developing theory of changes for programs right before we evaluate them, because we need to do it in order to know what to evaluate. Can be done at any stage. Okay, we are now at time, so that's all we have time for today. Thank you so much for joining us and for your insightful questions. We hope to see you learning with us at the Clear Horizon Academy again soon.